just want to make sure you've all had your coffee, lots of coffee for this topic. I just want to say thank you to Tom Smith for scheduling Ron and me in the morning and not after lunch. That's a good thing. I just want to thank Ron James again for a great presentation. You did hear from him that he's now the Executive Director of the Comstock Foundation for History and Culture, and it's a pleasure for me to work with Ron, his attorney as well, and he and I both worked for the Comstock Mining. As you know, may not know, Comstock Mining also owns the Gold Hill Hotel. So the Comstock Mining is really making an effort to restore the area around Gold Hill. Ron James is at the forefront of that, and I think he's started out just with a tremendous bang, trying to refurbish the Yellow Jacket. He's also, you may not know, an author of many, many books, and you can find Ron James books out there on the history of Nevada and many other aspects. So, Ron James, I really appreciate that. And what do you think? Was that a good presentation? What's disgusting is that Ron doesn't need any notes. I mean, he's got it all up here, having worked for more than 30 years on the history of Nevada and the area. So he doesn't need to do that. Unfortunately, I need to have notes. I'll be working a lot from notes and see if I can remember some of the things. Over the years, I've really enjoyed the annual conference presentations here, and obviously we see a lot of things about railroad cars and buildings and those kinds of things, but I'm interested in history, and I wanted to know more about the V&T business and the people. I'm also interested in law, surprisingly, and politics. I was a political science major, and I wanted to know more about those as they involved the V&T. So I looked into it, did a lot of reading, and then I made the mistake of just mentioning that, hey, maybe I should volunteer to do a presentation. Oh boy. Well, I did some preliminary research, and that research just led to more and more. I spoke with Stephen Drew, and I thought, oh my gosh, this guy knows more already than I'll ever know. And then I suddenly realized what a huge task was ahead of me. More importantly, the task was how to present such a dry subject to this conference. Well, take a look at what we have here on the screen. Isn't that a great locomotive? But when I'm talking about the power behind the railroad, we're not talking locomotives. We're going to be talking about a lot of other things, about politics and law and the real power that drove the V&T. There's lots of challenges that I faced, a lot of details, it's complicated, and I found out that the V&T and how it came about and operated involved all different aspects of the Comstock at the time. And I thought Ron James did a great job of just letting you know the background, what was going on before the V&T came along. So I think it's best for me if I just give a condensed version of what's a big story. And my version is only going to be up to about 1875. First, you have to learn the mechanics. It's not turning on. There we go. Well, here were some of the questions I had that prompted my presentation. I wanted to know what the conditions of life were for which the V&T was needed, what the relevant events were going on, what kind of legal and political power the V&T had in its early years, and of course, who were the ones that were instrumental in creating and running the V&T. I wanted to know more about the people. So that last shot you saw of the locomotive, I hope you really remember that, because that's the only train you're going to see in this presentation. So I also handed out a little timeline of some of the events going on around the V&T. I'm not going to talk anything about what's in that handout, but this timeline, I hope, puts it in perspective of what was happening and what had happened at the time when the B&T was created. So, and also Ron James, again, I thank for putting it in perspective. So the first thing we're going to, it's not. There you It worked once for him. Let's see if it will work again. So we're just going to talk about leading up to the B&T. Hey, it worked. What do you know? I want to talk about the situation on the Comstock first. On the Comstock, you heard a little bit about it from Ron James. There was a need for efficiency and lower cost in transporting the ore. They had to use the toll roads, they had to use Teamsters. That was the way they got everything to and from Virginia City, Gold Hill, the Comstock. The toll roads, though, the other roads were in very poor condition, especially in bad weather, bogged down. As a result of having to use all this, the toll roads, the Teamsters, the mine, it was very expensive as well. The mines were sending to processing only those ores that were easier to process. The subpar ores were being stockpiled at the mines. I also read a lot that the toll roads were very congested. I think I read some authors who say it was nose to tail, if you can envision that, all along those toll roads. So there was a need for transportation for water and for wood that went into the mines and the buildings, the need for transportation for all kinds of supplies, of course, and equipment to the Virginia City, Gold Hill, and a need for better transportation to and from Reno and San Francisco and parts east. Well, just as an example, here's a photo of a mule-drawn ore wagon weighing out at the Gould and Curry mine in 1865. The wagons were very slow. You can see how big those wagons had to be. They were limited in their weight, in the weight they could carry. They were expensive. The rain turned the dirt roads into quagmires. Here you can barely make out a 14-horse lumber cart. You can see a lot of horsepower needed in that. And here's from J. Ross Brown, the author mentioned by Ron, his depiction of the ore carts being hauled by oxen and horses. I don't know if this was actually true. If you listen to what Ron was saying, I'm not sure what to believe out of J. Ross Brown. Hauling the ore, but you can see how big those ore carts were. And of course, this really depicts the need for wood and transportation. You had the square set timber system that went into the mines. You can imagine all the wood that took to supply the mines. Here was a water cart that had to do more transportation. I'm not really sure if this was from our Virginia City. It's probably from Virginia City, Montana. The fact was that they were cutting timber in the nearby hills and forests with really no organization to log the more distant mountains. So as you may know, they logged the heck out of the close nearby mountains. So here's a picture of the toll roads to the Comstock before the B&T. You see, let's see if I can figure this out. There we go. This is Virginia City, of course, and we had the roads, the toll roads across American Flats that went either on down toward Carson City or down through Washoe Valley onto Washoe City. And they were milling, actually, in Washoe City early on. You had the other toll roads north out of Virginia City on down Geiger Grade, Steamboat Springs. Have we heard anything about Steamboat Springs? Yeah. And then north on up here to the Truckee River and Reno area. And of course you had the toll road right through Washoe Valley all along to Carson City, along Washoe Lake. So that was what was going on as far as transportation leading up to the B&T. The economy at the time was not good, as Ron alluded to. It was in a recession after the initial boom period. In 1864, the mines weren't producing near as much as they were. The mills didn't have sufficient materials for constantly milling, and mills at that time were not efficient without the constant milling. There was an association of Virginia City banks, Gold Hill banks at the time. They were charging 3 to 5% interest per month in 1863. So you can imagine if the mills were not operating as they should have been at the time, they were not able to make money, they were going to be defaulting on their loans. But the banks were even enforcing those defaults consistently. Well, along comes, at this time, the Bank of California is organizing an opening in San Francisco in July of 1864, opened by Darius Ogden or D.O. Mills and William Ralston. It actually dominated the financial circles at the time with a power board of directors. It had more than $2 million in operating capital. It had started out, because it was so good, so much in operating capital, that it was designated as a depository for U.S. monies at the time. And its amount of depository money, operating capital at the time was bigger than any other banks in the country except for two in New York. It handled a lot of the Comstock mine financing and the profits at the time. Now I want to talk to you just a little bit about some of the men that became important to the B&T at the time. Here are two of them. I'll give you a little background about it, both of them. D.O. Mills started out in New York as a clerk, a bank cashier, part owner of a bank. He joined the gold rushers also, and he established a general and exchange business. His character was that he was cautious but deliberate, and he followed a methodical business principles. Well, because of that, he returned to New York. He bought a shipload of general merchandise to sell in Sacramento. He had it shipped out, and that's what he did in Sacramento. Then he founded the Gold Bank of D.O. Mills, and he had made a fortune by 1857. With that fortune, he was buying timberland and railroad leading to it. He also bought interests in silver mines in California. Eventually, he would found the Bank of California, of course, with William Ralston. You might not know this, but D.O. Mills was the one who brokered the compromise between the Central Pacific and San Francisco financial community for construction of the Central Pacific Railroad. And he would later build the S.F. Mills building, and then he would buy an estate out in the country and name it what you might be familiar with, Millbrae. He became a really great philanthropist in San Francisco and New York. And in the 1950s, you may know about this as well, after the demise of the B&T, the Mills estate sold about 50 acres to Carson City for $10. That's known today as Mills Park. A little bit about William Ralston. He was born in Ohio, and he worked on Mississippi River boats and ships. He also worked in a powerful banking firm. He was associated with Cornelius Vanderbilt and other powerhouses. And he eventually would become the manager of the Vanderbilt West Coast operations in San Francisco. He operated a bank with other partners in San Francisco. He was involved in a lot of business dealings in California. And contrary to D.O. Mills, William Ralston was a risk taker. He bought a lot of patents, for instance. He provided capital for a wide variety of endeavors. He lent money, bank money, by the way, to friends without proper securities. He took a lot of chances. But he also invested in the Comstock mines, and he made a fortune as well. He handled a lot of the Comstock Lowe's wealth, and he actually was the treasurer of many Comstock mines. His partners and he eventually split, and he opened the Bank of California with D.O. Mills. After that, he was involved in almost all of the major financial deals in the western states. And using bank monies, he was involved in many schemes, ventures around the West at that time. And eventually he would build the Palace Hotel in San Francisco with bank money, and that would cause problems as well. Well, another person working for the bank at the time, you may have heard this man's name, William Sharon. He was born in Ohio. He was a small-framed man and worked on the rivers as well. very interesting. He also farmed. One of the problems he had in his businesses was that his partner stole his profits while he was working on the river. Let's mark this down as one. Here's the good thing about him. He was trained as a lawyer. He's a really good guy. But he trained in the office of Edward Stanton. Anybody hear that name before? Became the Secretary of War for Abraham Lincoln. Well, he moved to San Francisco, he moved to St. Louis after that, and he passed the bar exam in Missouri. But he had bad health at the time. He moved on to Illinois, and he ran a mercantile at the time. He would eventually move west with a lot of merchandise in 1849 to Sacramento. So it was very similar to some of the things we heard from our other individuals, Mills and Ralston. Well, here's strike two. A flood swept away his business in Sacramento. After that, he'd lost everything. He moved to San Francisco. He got involved in small politics. He married. He bought and sold a lot of land. He became well known for his what he knew about the land in San Francisco, and he made a fortune. He also invested in Comstock mines, and notably, he was swindled in a stock deal. He became friends with Ralston because Ralston had married the niece of Sharon's longtime friend, John Fry. And eventually, Sharon became Ralston's partner. You can remember that name, John or J.D. Fry. You'll hear it later. Well, Sharon traveled to Virginia City in 1864 on behalf of the bank. He tried to help the bank at that time recoup some property that was owed to it on a debt. Of course, the bank was financing a lot of things going on up at the Comstock at the time. Well, he chose the specific deeds, notes, and mortgages that were necessary to recover, and he recovered almost all the claims. He was very successful at that. But while he was in Virginia City, he got the idea to open a bank branch. He talked at that time with a lot of the mining engineers. You've got to remember what Ron James said. At this time, we've got a decline or a recession going on. He was talking, so Sharon was talking with the mining engineers. He had to get some assurance that there were mineral veins out there to continue the mining would be good enough for them. And he saw at that time, as you've probably surmised now from what we've talked about, that the mining, the milling, the transportation, and the lumbering were all inefficient and expensive. And Sharon was an organizer and a planner. He argued to the bank owners that the risk that they could see could be managed if a branch in Virginia City closely tracked the mining process and organized it. Well, they bought in. We had a California bank branch open in October of 1864, and Sharon was appointed as the manager. That building was at C Street and Taylor Street. You saw a predecessor building in Ron's presentation, but here is the Bank of California building that exists today at C Street and Taylor Street on the northwest corner. And Sharon's living quarters would eventually be on the second floor for a while. On the side of the building today is this plaque dedicated to William Sharon. And it basically says, I don't know if you can read that very well, but it says that he managed the Bank of California during the Bonanza period. He was called the King of the Comstock. He was the father of the Virginia and Truckee Railroad. He formed the Union Mill and Mining Company, and he was eventually elected senator, United States Senator in 1875. This plaque says, it was oftentimes disliked by many. William Sharon was one of the major developers of the Comstock lode. Well, the bank was a success. We need to talk a little bit about how it became a success. One of the major things is, I think, that Sharon took advantages of the weaknesses he saw in the banking and mining that we've talked about. And he first offered for the bank loans on good security at 2% interest per month. What a great deal, 2% interest per month. Huh? But it undercut the Virginia City Bank Association. And that was very helpful for all the mills and the mines. He gave large advances to the mills and the mines on the good security. because of his business now, the bank association would dissolve. The mills could keep up their payments only as long as there was enough ore to process, as we mentioned, and the ore was decreasing from late 1864 until the early 1870s. And with idle mills, the payments, of course, can't be kept up. Mill upkeep is very costly. We're in the middle of a recession. The stock values on the San Francisco Exchange are falling as the mine explorations are disappointing. Thousands are abandoning Virginia City. And what happens? In May of 1865, the bank forecloses on a mill in Gold Canyon. Well, you got to remember the mills don't have any stockholders to assess for all the costs that they're facing. The mills just have owners. It's the mines that have the stockholders. Mill equipment can't be sold because the shipping rates are prohibited. And of course you go into foreclosure if you can't pay the loans. Well, these bad times concerned the bank owners as well. So now Sharon had before him, he had to convince the bank owners not to close the Virginia City branch. He argued that the closure would accelerate depression. There was extravagant spending going on, he said, in the mines and the mills, and there was wasteful mining. As you heard, they stockpiled some of their mine product. And he said this all precipitated a loss in dividends for the mines. He argued if you worked it systematically, you could reduce costs. And of course, you've got the mills that are sitting idle with bad management. He said we ought to take control of the promising mines. We should mill the ore ourselves. At that time, there was no real symbiotic relationship between the mills and the mines. And Sharon saw this. Well, the bank owners were still concerned about taking on the mills and all their costs and the potential bank losses. Well, Sharon said that he and Ralston would take personal responsibility for those costs and potential losses. And what did he do after that? He went out and cross-checked all the ore assays with several different assayers at the time to determine where the best gold strikes could be or were estimated to be. And he acquired the mine interests before the reports of those assays were published.
Insider trading.
No, that's not insider trading. Well, they were successful again, and here's a photo of the Gold Hill branch of the Bank of California. The mines were reworked to claim the overlooked ore. They controlled mining, was stabilizing the expenses. They found more gold at lower depths, and as a result, the bank opened its branch in Gold Hill. 1867, the bank now owns 7 defaulting mills. What does the bank do? They had all that security. These mills were defaulting on their loans. They picked them up. And they own 7 of them. So they're saying, well, now what do? We own all these mills. Well, they said, okay, let's form a company to manage all of this mill property. And they did. They formed the Union Mill and Mining Company. You see the owners at the time, Ralston Mills and Sharon. Here's some other names that you're going to want to remember. Thomas Sunderland, Charles Bonner, Thomas Bell, Karen, Thomas Bell, William Barron, Alvinza Howard. I said Hayward, right? This group would become known as the bank ring. Well, you saw photos of Mills, Ralston, and Sharon, and I wasn't able to come up with photos of others. I was amazed at that, but here is a photo of Hayward, and the spelling I got was Alvinza. Somebody else, like Steve, believes it's spelled differently, but I'll leave that to you to figure that out. But now the bank owns up to 17 mills within 2 years. Many of them are on the Carson River with power for milling. And the company stockholders happen to be principal owners of the most productive mines. And what do? They send their ore to the mills owned by the company. pressure is also exerted on the non-bank ring trustees of other mines to feed their ore to the union mill and mining mills. What happens is the outside mills are starving. When they starve, they can't make the payments. What happens? The bank buys them up. And the mines, remember they have shareholders, they're paying these huge processing fees to the mills. Well, they don't have to worry too much about that because they can assess their stockholders for the fees, and unfortunately, the dividends are lowered for the mines. And the mills that don't have any shareholders are the ones that are making the money processing all this ore now. And who are the owners of the mills? The bank ring. Here's some other activities I want you to be aware of too, of the bank ring. They got involved in several other areas. First, they got involved in water rights. Some litigation broke out on the Carson River in 1864 when a mill owner by the name of Henry Yarrington filed suit. Unfortunately, the upstream ranchers in Carson Valley won in federal court in San Francisco. The court said that those in Carson Valley were prior in time to the mill owners. Well, you know, that didn't deter Sharon. He bought up some Dayton water rights. And do you remember where the first settlement was in Nevada? Dayton. Okay. Well, he took his action to the state courts, litigated water rights. Guess what? The Dayton settler water rights predated the rancher agricultural diversions upstream. So the owners on the river, now the mills, have superior rights according to the state. And with the help of a state court judge, Sharon was enforcing his rights. That state court judge would later turn out to be one of the lawyers for the V&T. They were into drinking water too. The local wells were failing by the 1860s. The mining tunnels provided some water. There were a lot of water problems, water level problems in the mines. The water, they were providing drinking water, but it wasn't very good. Ron alluded to that as well, that it was mineralized, it was contaminated. But Sharon bought the local water company, and he controlled the stock anyway of the water company, which obtained rights to the water. He didn't keep that very long. He sold that out a little bit later, just before the inverse siphon was put in from Lake Tahoe to Virginia City. They were into lumber. The bank ring was buying mountains of pine in the neighboring ranges. The bank ring employees, you might remember those names, Yarrington and Bliss. They incorporated the Carson Tahoe Lumber and Fluming Company, the Lake Tahoe Railway and Transportation Company on Lake Bigler, which is now Lake Tahoe. The lumbering provided up to 5 million feet of lumber per month from these 8-foot diameter sugar pines, and 600 million feet to the mines and the mills up to the 1880s. And the bank group got into railroads, or at least one railroad, the V&T Railroad. Sharon and his investors filed in May of 1867 with the state to organize a railroad. And this railroad, notice this, was going to go from Gold Hill north to the Truckee River and connect with the Central Pacific Railroad coming through Lakes Crossing or Reno at the time. And that would ignore Carson City and Washoe Valley. Do you think they were happy about that? And all those other mill owners besides the bank group along the Carson River, they demanded a route change. Well, Sharon said, okay, I guess we can do that if Ormsby and Washoe counties will buy $200,000 in stock. He changed the line to run along Carson River near his mills, near the bank group's mills, and to Carson City near the timber resources there. The original stockholders of the V&T are bank ring members and 9 others, including Henry Yarrington. Now we have a Bank of California with all these varied holdings. They have mills, mines, lumber, railroad, water rights. Sure looks like an effort at some kind of a monopoly to me.
called vertical integration.
That's right, vertical integration, exactly. I wasn't gonna use the word, but it's exactly what it was, vertical integration. So now we need to talk about actually starting the V&T. What are we gonna do? How do you start a railroad? Well, the first thing you heard just a little bit about, you've gotta get your authority first. And they filed in 1867. As you heard with the Secretary of State, they incorporated in March of 1868. Mills, Sharon, and Ralston did. Notably, there had been an effort previously in the territorial legislature and the state legislature, and those legislatures had authorized the construction of railroads four different times that I recall. In 1862, they authorized the construction of the Lake Bigler and Virginia Railroad Company, the Virginia City and Silver City Railroad Company, the V&T Railroad Company. In '64, the state legislature authorized again the V&T Railroad Company, which never came to fruition. We didn't have the financial backing at the time. They didn't have somebody with the know-how, the knowledge to get something going like that. So the authority was picked up. The old franchise rights were acquired by William Sharon, and he got the authority to build the railroad. What do you have to do next? Yes, question?
I don't believe that Sharon picked up any franchise rights. The legislature had expiration of the rights on the date of March 1868. So the rights of the previous railroads expired.
Well, you're correct in that those previous rights by the legislature had expired. But the reading that I had did indicate several times that Sharon picked up some franchise rights. That's a good question. I don't know what franchise rights those would be,
I found no
but they were.
documentation.
I didn't find any either. So
He didn't need.
I didn't find any either. I'm going strictly by what some of the books have said at the time. But in any event, he did get the authority to do that. And he did file with the Secretary of State and incorporate at the time, and they moved forward. Good question, good insight. The next thing you've got to do is get your money. Was there a question back in the back?
A lot of those rights are easement, weren't they?
That's one thing that I didn't even talk about. He got authority, meaning authority from the state to actually have a company, but he did have to acquire land as well. That was a big undertaking.
After that last run in 1950, they had a lot of litigation over easements.
Yeah.
And of course, those go back 90 years, back to the 1860s, and in 90 years, people had died, there'd been inheritance, there'd been sales, and everything else. And we had a retired professor from the university. He was a professor of civil engineering, but he also had some legal background, and he was hired on a couple of occasions to try to work out easements. And this is in the 1950s, and those went on into the 1960s, and I never knew how that was resolved because people would look back into their family's history and say, oh, yeah, I guess it was an easement, and what do we do about that? I wondered if you had any information on that.
Good insight. Did everybody hear that question or the comment? The comment was that the railroad, obviously Sharon, had to buy a lot of rights across property to operate the railroad, and he did. I don't feel that my presentation has time to get into all of that. I was counsel to the Department of Transportation for a number of years, and I know how involved you can get with title to land and easements and all the problems that can come up legally with property rights. So I didn't feel I could get into that in this. It would really be a big mess. But he is right that in the 1950s and before that, there was a lot of litigation concerning the rights that the railroad had picked up and to what extent those rights were held by anybody. But, he did have to acquire a lot of property rights, and I can't answer any more questions at this point. I don't have that information. The second thing you've got to do is get your money, of course. You've got to organize. And I said, the best way to get money, the best thing to do for your railroad, use other people's money. And I think that's what he did. The cost of construction turned out to be $1.75 million. They collected $2.7 million. They had $500,000 in county bonds. Of course, they promised reduced prices for transporting goods. They promised an increase in property values. They promised increase in assessed property for the V&T Railroad. Roadbed they estimated would be $40,000 per mile. And later it would turn out that the assessed values, the V&T was trying to keep down the assessed values, a lot less than $40,000 a mile. Ormsby County was in for $200,000. Story County was in for $300,000 in bonds. And they would fight for years to make up or pay for those bonds. There were $700,000 collected from mines for the exchange of reduced freight charges. The Yellow Jacket, owned then by Sharon and others, gave $150,000, but all the board had to do was levy an assessment on the shareholders to come up with that money. And $1.5 million came from Mills and Ralston, or actually the bank.
Brian?
Yes.
The original agreement, the counties wanted to buy stock and have seats on the board of directors, but there was a state law against public agencies owning stock in railroads.
Did everybody hear that? The counties at the time wanted to buy stock in the railroad instead of bonds, and have seats on the board of directors, but at the time there was a law against counties and governments actually having representatives on board of directors of private companies. You've got your authority, you've got your money, you should consolidate your power. Use all your connections, I think, with the and the ownerships from the Bank of California. Form a real strong board of directors. You can control mining and milling, lumber and transportation. And here's your initial board of directors for the V&T: Sharon, Ralston, Mills, Thomas Bell, and J.D. Fry. Remember that name? So you've consolidated your power, all these things that were operated by the Bank of California. And here are some of the stockholders at the time in July of 1869. Maintaining control with strong shareholders. You've got Sharon and Hayward, Mills and Ralston, and here's Thomas Sunderland. He's the first president of the V&T Railroad. He was a Bank of California lawyer. Another good guy, right? But at the time, he wanted to run for Senate. And this is interesting, that William Sharon thought that that was a little bit of a conflict. It looked like maybe he was trying to get more political sway by being president of the V&T. So they figured he better not have that position of president. And who would take over as president of the V&T? William Sharon. Other shareholders had Barron, Bonner, Bell, and we had F.A. Triddle. This is a notable individual down at the bottom here, another lawyer. He was president initially of Yellow Jacket Mine. He was a Transcontinental Railroad Commissioner later on. He would be a governor's candidate in 1870, and he later would be the territorial governor for Arizona. Some more shareholders. John Winters was another mine mill manager, Yellow Jacket president at the time. And John P. Jones, you see a photo of him here on the right. He had been a Crown Point mine superintendent for the bank ring. He was a hero of the Yellow Jacket fire, and he ultimately would become U.S. Senator and serve for 30 years for Nevada. He actually beat William Sharon in 1872 for the Senate seat. A few more: Williams, Yarrington, you might have heard that name before, and the others at the bottom. So now the next step is to actually build the railroad. So they had H.M. Yarrington hired as the superintendent. He broke ground in 1869, and the operations began later that year in November, running from Virginia City to Carson City. Here you see an early picture of H.M. Yarrington and his wife. And I was told that this guy over here on the right was Henry Arrington, but I've been told recently that that's not true. The family says that is not him. It sure looked a lot like him. So I couldn't find another picture of Henry Arrington. So maybe we need to have somebody someday give a talk about H.M. Arrington. What do you think of that? Stephen might be a good for that, don't you think? Well, there were immediate results from the railroad. The price of cordwood dropped, the price of carrying ore dropped. The lesser grade ore is now worth milling. Got, actually, Washoe City Milling is closing down because all the other mills were taking up the work. The other transportation costs were falling. The long haul teamsters and the packers would go out of business. The roads are no longer congested, but of course they're not used as much. And the longevity of the Comstock is actually increased, as Ron James mentioned this morning. V&T profits were coming in at about $12,000 a day. The V&T was employing up to about 400. The freights were about $60,000 to $90,000 per month, maybe a little bit less also at Gold Hill.
Ryan,
Yes?
is that 12,000 a day, is that after expenses or gross?
The question is whether that 12,000 a day is after expenses, and I'm not real clear about it. My understanding was his profit. Of course, the V&T then would build spurs to the properties that it owned, or that bank members owned. The Kings Canyon Flume area, the Summit Flume, to the Eureka Mill, of course. In 1872, a connection was ultimately made to Reno and the Central Pacific. Here's the nice thing, the V&T was paying dividends to its shareholders of up to $90,000 per month. $2.5 million stock dividend was declared in 1874. So what do you do with all this success, this power? I don't have time to go into a lot of the specifics, but you use what you've got to control what you can. The politics, the economy, and the V&T and the bank crowd, of course, is certainly a power on the Comstock up to 1875 and certainly beyond. We can talk about some of the things that were pointed out in the newspapers of the day. I can't get into the specifics in the short time that I've got. Got the Gold Hill newspaper in 1870 saying that Sharon bribed legislators and deceived the people to build the railroad. I can't imagine that. It said the legislators were in the pay of Sharon and the Supreme Court has become Sharonic. 1871, the newspapers were saying that the Sharon and the bank ring controlled nearly all the producing mines on the Comstock, and they were lobbying the legislature to further reduce taxing of the mines. And as I mentioned earlier, they would also lobby the assessors in the different counties to lower the assessment on railroad property. Sharon would run for Senate in 1872, but he would, as I mentioned earlier, have to withdraw. He said it was due to ill health, but at that time, J.P. Jones was the one who was in power, and he was increasing. It was said in newspapers that there were disturbing amounts of money that were thrown around in that election in 1872. And across the country, it was known that from the beginning, Nevada was sending its wealthiest to the U.S. Senate, and that earned them the designation, the Rotten Borough.
Yeah, we still have.
You mean it hasn't changed today? Oh. Well, Sharon is also said to have run the San Francisco Stock Exchange in the 1870s. A lot of newspapers, or some newspapers, were against Sharon and the bank ring, and they certainly talked a lot about him. But if a newspaper is against you, talk to the editor or buy the newspaper. So Sharon actually authorized the bank to lend money to his supporter, Alf Doughton, in 1872 to buy the Gold Hill News. Remember, he was running for Senate at the time. Sharon bought them in the Territorial Enterprise in 1874 and installed Roland Daggett as the editor. Notably, the Territorial Enterprise had crushed Sharon's expectations in 1872 running for Senate. So he said, well, I guess I better buy that newspaper.
Brian, there was another reason they did that. His opponent, General Williams, bought the Virginia Chronicle before Sharon bought the Enterprise. So it was just, and then Sutro farmed the Virginia Independent.
Exactly. There were several newspapers at the time in Virginia City. It was pointed out that the opponents bought the other newspapers as well. So Sharon joined in buying a newspaper. You remember more efforts, what was happening at the time? The bankering employees were buying, incorporating the lumber, flume, and railway companies. Well, here's a picture of Dwayne Bliss and his wife at the time. Sharon did win the Senate seat in 1874. And you have to remember at the time that the senators were elected by the state legislatures until that constitutional amendment came into effect. And it was said that they spent up to $800,000 in an election in 1874, that Sharon spent that much. That's a pretty penny, especially at that time. He had support, of course, of the Bank of California. He had Senator Jones' support at that time then, and he had the Central Pacific Railroad's support. And it was alleged that William Ralston was influencing senators and congressmen, and that Sharon was dominating Nevada's judges and state and local officers. I guess he did it right. Huh? Here's what the San Francisco Chronicle described Sharon as in 1874. He was a king because he won the right to rule by demonstrating he possessed, and here's the quote, the active brain and shrewdness of intellect that enabled him to acquire money and to make it productive. Another author said that it is said that to win any office in Nevada, a candidate must first make his peace in the office of the V&T Railroad. And Bertha Brown, in Tale of Three Cities in 1964, said that any aspiring Republican candidate in Nevada had to square up with Yarrington down at the depot first. Well, what I've given you is just a taste, an overview of how the V&T came about and the real power behind the railroad. I've only given you a view up until about 1874, 1875. I can't possibly give you all the details of all the events up to this point. I have looked through a lot of the records in the clerk's offices in the Supreme Court, and the Carson City District Court, and the Story County Court. And I didn't see at that time that it was real clear that the V&T was always a winner. Of course, a lot of those lawsuits were personal injury lawsuits, a lot of injuries and accidents occurring on the railroad. And they didn't, the V&T didn't always win those, but I guess you have to have the broader picture that could probably be somewhat depicted by some of the newspapers of the time, some of the thoughts of the citizens at the time. After this period of time in 1874, 1875, there would be a lot more drama on the Comstock. The bankering would lose power. There would be personal problems and challenges for Ralston and for Sharon that I haven't gone into and mentioned. Bankering members would turn against the ring. Others would take over as kings of the Comstock. We haven't talked about those. But the V&T would do well for a while and maintain its power, as you heard some of the quotes we've talked about. For now, though, you've just seen a little bit of the politics and the law of the V&T and the power behind the railroad. Just want to let you know, there's an awful lot of material out there, from UNR to other places that I looked at. We just got the tip of the very top of the surface of the V&T. There's a lot of things going on if anybody else wants to delve into it. I just want to acknowledge, or maybe not, Stephen Drew for saying I should do this. And, the special collections at UNR, the Historical Society, and Wendell Huff was helpful also. There's a lot of good records now at the Nevada State Railroad Museum. Ron James was very helpful in all his publications. Even the local community college library has a lot of the books that are necessary. And as I told you, I went to the clerks of the various courts in the area. So I appreciate that. So that's about all I can give you right now in the limited time that I have. And I'd be happy to answer, or try to answer some questions, or we can have Ron James and Steve Drew come up and answer questions.
Yeah, as a total Dayton supporter, I have to point out that you showed all the toll roads, but the first toll roads and freight roads were largely from Dayton because we were the transportation center initially. And in addition to that, in the very early years, we had over half the mills that on the Comstock were in Dayton. There was a giant series of floods in 1861 and 62 that wiped out a bunch of those. But since gold was discovered in Dayton, many of the mills, both Carson River mills and Arastras to run when the river was low, were in Dayton. In addition to that, we had wood. There were giant wood drives in those days that brought the wood down, and that continued later once the V&T was built. But we had giant wood drives that came down and left the wood. A lot of the wood in the mines came from the wood drives down the Carson River from the Sierra to Dayton. So I got to put my 2 cents worth in.
Brian, one of the
Let's just
reasons.
take about maybe 2 or 3 more questions, Mike.